In the gray waters off the French Atlantic coast, three of Nazi Germany's most powerful warships sit at anchor. It is the winter of 1942, and for nearly a year, the battleships Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, alongside the heavy cruiser Prinz Eugen, have been trapped in the port of Brest, hunted, bombed, and slowly deteriorating under the relentless attention of the Royal Air Force. What happens next will become one of the most audacious naval operations of the Second World War. A gamble so outrageous that even German admirals believe it impossible. A dash through waters the British have controlled for 3 centuries, and a failure of British intelligence so catastrophic that it will be compared to nothing less than the shame of the Spanish Armada. This is the story of Operation Cerberus, the Channel Dash. To understand why 3 German capital ships would attempt to steam through the English Channel in broad daylight, we must first understand how they came to be trapped. In January 1941, Scharnhorst and Gneisenau had embarked on Operation Berlin, a 2-month rampage through the North Atlantic that would sink 22 Allied merchant ships totaling 115,000 tons. It was precisely the kind of commerce raiding that Winston Churchill feared most. But by March 1941, with the Royal Navy closing in and Scharnhorst suffering from chronic boiler problems, both ships sought refuge in the French port of Brest. Prinz Eugen would join them that June, fresh from her participation in the destruction of HMS Hood, the pride of the British fleet. Brest should have been a temporary stop. Instead, it became a prison. RAF Bomber Command launched a relentless campaign against the harbor. Month after month, wave after wave of bombers struck at the German squadron. On the 6th of April 1941, a single Beaufort torpedo bomber piloted by Flying Officer Kenneth Campbell weaved through a storm of anti-aircraft fire to put a torpedo into Gneisenau's starboard side. Campbell died in the attack and would receive a posthumous Victoria Cross. 4 days later, 4 bombs struck the same ship, killing 75 crewmen and jamming her main turret. By the winter of 1941, the 3 ships had become what Luftwaffe General Adolf Galland would later describe as fly traps, static targets absorbing punishment that might otherwise fall on the German homeland. Something had to be done. On 29 December 1941, at the Wolfslair headquarters in East Prussia, Adolf Hitler summoned Grand Admiral Erich Raeder to discuss the fate of the Brest squadron. Hitler's mind was focused on Norway. He had convinced himself that the Allies would soon attempt to seize the Norwegian coastline, and he wanted every available warship positioned to repel them. Norway, he declared, was the zone of destiny, a place whose defense could decide the outcome of the entire war. The ships at Brest, Hitler told Raeder, were like a patient with cancer, doomed without an operation. And the operation he had in mind was radical indeed. The entire squadron would break out through the English Channel in daylight, steam past the white cliffs of Dover, and return to German waters. Raeder was stunned. He had assumed that if the ships were to return to Germany, they would take the longer route, north around Scotland, through the Denmark Strait. The Channel Passage seemed suicidal. It meant sailing within range of British coastal artillery, through waters patrolled by destroyers, submarines, and aircraft. It meant traversing the Strait of Dover, just 21 miles wide, under the very guns of the enemy. Impossible, Raeder reportedly said, but Hitler was insistent. The British, he argued, were incapable of taking and carrying out lightning decisions. They would expect the ships to move through the Dover Strait at night. Therefore, the Germans would do exactly the opposite. They would depart Brest at night, gaining a head start under cover of darkness, and pass through the narrowest point of the channel at noon, in broad daylight when Luftwaffe fighters could provide maximum protection. It was counterintuitive to the point of audacity, and that, Hitler believed, was precisely why it would work. On the 12th of January 1942, Raeder formally presented the plan to Hitler in Berlin. The Führer approved it immediately. The operation would be codenamed Cerberus, after the 3-headed dog that guards the gates of the underworld. If Operation Cerberus was to succeed, it would depend almost entirely on one man, Adolf Galland, the 30-year-old general of fighters, already one of Germany's most decorated pilots. Galland's task was to create something unprecedented, a continuous fighter umbrella that would shield the squadron for the entire 30-hour passage. The Luftwaffe would mount Operation Donnerkeil, meaning thunderbolt, Working from his headquarters at Jever, Galland assembled a force of approximately 250 fighters, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, and the formidable new Focke-Wulf 190s. These aircraft would fly in rotating shifts, maintaining a minimum of 16 fighters over the ships at all times, rising to 32 as they passed through the Dover Strait. Each flight would patrol for 30 minutes before being relieved. Aircraft would be turned around, refueled, and rearmed in no more than 30 minutes. Between 22nd January and 10th February, Galland conducted 8 full rehearsals involving some 450 sorties. Radio silence would be absolute. Every pilot understood that the success of the operation depended on surprise. Meanwhile, the naval preparations were equally meticulous. Vice Admiral Otto Ciliax, a stern disciplinarian known to his men as the Black Tsar, would command the operation from the bridge of Scharnhorst. 6 destroyers would escort the squadron out of Brest, with additional destroyers, torpedo boats, and E-boats joining at predetermined points along the route. Most critically, German minesweepers had been quietly clearing a safe passage through the channel for weeks. Working in seemingly unconnected segments to avoid detection, they had swept 119 mines and marked the cleared channels with buoys. The individual segments would only be connected on the eve of the operation. The departure date was set for 11th February 1942, 4 days before the new moon, when tides would be most favorable and nights at their darkest. Across the Channel, the British were not entirely unaware that something was brewing. Since April 1941, the Admiralty had maintained a contingency plan called Operation Fuller, a coordinated response to a German breakout from Brest. The plan called for motor torpedo boats from Dover and Ramsgate, Swordfish torpedo bombers from the Fleet Air Arm, Beaufort torpedo bombers from Coastal Command, Bomber Command heavy bombers, and the 6 destroyers based at Harwich. The Dover coastal guns, capable of firing their 9.2-inch shells more than 20 miles, would engage any ship that came within range. Ultra-decrypts from Enigma intercepts had provided excellent intelligence. By early February, the Admiralty knew that ship gunners from the Brest squadron had been training in the Baltic. They knew that German reinforcements were concentrating: 7 destroyers, 10 torpedo boats, more than 30 minesweepers, and 25 E-boats. On the 2nd of February 1942, the Admiralty issued an assessment stating that the Channel route was the most likely German option. And yet, when the moment came, Britain was almost completely blind. The submarine HMS Celian, stationed off Brest to watch for any departure, withdrew on the evening of the 11th of February to recharge her batteries and missed the breakout entirely. RAF Coastal Command had established 3 patrol lines across the Channel approaches, but on that crucial night all 3 failed. One Hudson aircraft had its radar malfunction and returned to base. Another was recalled when fog was forecast over British airfields. The third flew too far west and simply missed the German ships as they turned toward the Channel. Perhaps most damagingly, German signals intelligence under General Wolfgang Martini had been gradually increasing radar jamming for weeks. By 11th February, British coastal radar stations were receiving so much interference that their sets were, in the words of one operator, almost useless. Yet the significance of this jamming went unreported up the chain of command. The Germans were about to vanish into the fog of war. At 7:30 on the evening of the 11th of February 1942, the 3 great ships were preparing to cast off from Brest when air raid sirens began to wail. 18 RAF Wellington bombers were attacking the harbor. Vice Admiral Ciliax, pacing the bridge of Scharnhorst, could only wait as bombs fell, fortunately well clear of his ships. The all-clear sounded at approximately 9:15 p.m. Half an hour later, at 10:45 p.m. German time, Scharnhorst, Gneisenau, and Prinz Eugen slipped their moorings and headed for the open sea. The officers aboard had been briefed only that morning. The crews did not yet know their destination. French dockyard workers had been shown tropical helmets and oil barrels marked for use in the tropics, a deception suggesting the ships were bound for warmer waters. By 2 a.m. on 12th February, the squadron had cleared Ushant and entered the English Channel proper, steaming at 29 knots. Admiral Ciliax now addressed his crews over the ship's loudspeakers, finally revealing their mission. They were going home, through the English Channel. The first Luftwaffe night fighters appeared overhead at 6:30 a.m., just as the squadron passed the Cherbourg Peninsula. The weather was deteriorating. Broken clouds, moderate seas, westerly winds, and intermittent rain squalls. Visibility was poor and getting worse. It was exactly what the Germans needed. By 8 a.m., the squadron had steamed approximately 250 miles. They were now northwest of Le Havre, roughly 40 miles from the Dover Strait, and still undetected. The Luftwaffe day fighters had arrived, flying their rehearsed figure-8 patterns over the ships. And at the Dover radar stations, operators noticed something strange. Aircraft circling north of Le Havre, apparently engaged in air-sea rescue operations. No one raised the alarm. The breakthrough came not from radar, not from reconnaissance flights, not from any element of the carefully planned Operation Fuller, but from pure chance. At 10:42 a.m., 2 Spitfire pilots from RAF Kenley, returning from an intruder mission over France, spotted the German flotilla 16 miles off Le Touquet. The ships were surrounded by escorts and covered by fighters. The pilots, following standard procedure, maintained radio silence until they could land and report. At 11:05 a.m., more than 13 hours after the German departure, news of the sighting finally reached Vice Admiral Ramsay at Dover and the operations room at 11 Group Fighter Command. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The impossible was happening. German capital ships were already in the Strait of Dover, and the British were completely out of position. Ramsay immediately ordered Operation Fuller into action. Motor torpedo boats at Dover and Ramsgate were scrambled. The Harwich destroyer flotilla was alerted. At RAF Manston, 825 Naval Air Squadron was told to prepare its Swordfish torpedo bombers for immediate takeoff. Bomber Command began generating aircraft across eastern England. But the carefully coordinated plan that had existed on paper was about to disintegrate into chaos. The Dover MTBs, 5 boats under Lieutenant Commander Nigel Pumphrey, raced toward the enemy at 11:55 a.m. They found the German squadron at 12:23 p.m., but their approach was blocked by 12 E-boats arranged in 2 defensive lines. Pumphrey's boats fired their torpedoes at the extreme range of 4,000 yards, almost 2 miles. Every torpedo missed. At 12:19 p.m., the Dover coastal guns, the great 9.2-inch batteries at South Foreland, finally opened fire. But visibility had dropped to 5 miles, and the gunners could not observe where their shells were landing. They fired 33 rounds. Every one missed, and now came the most tragic chapter of all. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Esmonde was 32 years old and already a hero. During the hunt for the Bismarck the previous May, he had led 825 Squadron Swordfish from HMS Victorious through appalling weather to score a torpedo hit on the German battleship. For this action, he had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order. Just the day before the Channel Dash, 11th February 1942, Esmonde had been at Buckingham Palace receiving his decoration from King George VI. Now he stood on the tarmac at Manston with 6 antiquated Fairey Swordfish torpedo bombers, fabric-covered biplanes with a maximum speed of 90 knots, and orders to attack the most heavily defended naval squadron in the world. The plan called for 5 squadrons of Spitfires to escort Esmonde's aircraft. Due to the chaos of the late detection, only 1 squadron, 10 Spitfires from 72 Squadron, made the rendezvous. Esmonde circled over Ramsgate, waiting. He knew what was coming. The German ships were protected by over 250 Luftwaffe fighters, with more than 100 in the air at any moment. His chances of survival were essentially nil. He could wait no longer. At 12:28 p.m., Esmonde led his 6 Swordfish toward the enemy, descending to 50 feet above the gray, heaving sea. The Spitfires tried to protect them, but they were immediately bounced by swarms of Bf-109s and FW-190s. Within minutes, the escort was scattered. The Swordfish pressed on alone. They emerged from a rain squall to find themselves facing the full fury of the German fleet. Battleships, cruisers, destroyers, E-boats, all pouring fire into the sky. Captain Hoffmann of Scharnhorst, watching through binoculars, would later say, "Poor fellows, they are so very slow. It is nothing but suicide for them to fly against these big ships." Esmonde's aircraft was hit almost immediately. His port wing was shot away by a shell burst. Witnesses saw the Swordfish stagger, release its torpedo, and plunge into the sea. There were no survivors. One by one, the remaining aircraft were torn apart. The entire attack lasted less than 15 minutes. All 6 Swordfish were destroyed. Of the 18 crew members, 13 were killed, including Esmonde. Only 5 men, all wounded, were pulled from the freezing water. Not a single torpedo found its target. Vice Admiral Ciliax himself would later call it the mothball attack of a handful of ancient planes, piloted by men whose bravery surpasses any other action by either side that day. Eugene Esmonde was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross, the only one given for the entire operation. The British attacks continued throughout the afternoon, but they were piecemeal, uncoordinated, and almost entirely ineffective. At 3:17 p.m., Captain Charles Pizzey's destroyers, Campbell, Vivacious, Worcester, Mackay, and Whitshed, finally made radar contact with the German squadron. These were aging ships, veterans of the First World War, racing through a force 7 gale with snow reducing visibility to almost nothing. Pizzey had made the desperate decision to cut across a British minefield to intercept the faster German ships. Remarkably, none of his destroyers struck a mine. But when they finally engaged, they faced overwhelming firepower. HMS Worcester closed to 2,200 yards, barely more than a mile, before launching her torpedoes. Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen turned their guns on her. 3 11-inch shells from Gneisenau and 5 8-inch shells from Prinz Eugen slammed into the destroyer. Her bridge was destroyed, her boiler rooms were wrecked, 27 of her crew were killed and 45 wounded. Every British torpedo missed. Meanwhile, Bomber Command had launched 242 aircraft against the German squadron, but the bombers had been loaded with semi-armor-piercing bombs designed for high-altitude attacks, useless against ships at low level. The weather was appalling. 10/10 cloud cover down to 700 feet, rain and visibility measured in yards. Of those 242 bombers, only 39 even found the German ships. Not a single bomb hit its target. 15 bombers were shot down. By late afternoon, with British forces exhausted and in disarray, it seemed that Operation Cerberus had succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. Then, the sea itself struck back. At 7:55 p.m. on 12th February, as the squadron entered the approaches to the Scheldt estuary near Flushing, Scharnhorst shuddered from a massive underwater explosion. She had struck a British magnetic mine. The damage was significant, but not fatal. The great battleship slowed, then resumed her course at 25 knots. Admiral Ciliax, believing his flagship might be crippled, transferred to the destroyer Z-29 and promptly suffered a collision that damaged the destroyer's propeller. He transferred again to the destroyer Hermann Schumann, from which he would complete the voyage. An hour later, at approximately 8:55 p.m., Gneisenau struck her own mine off the island of Terschelling. The explosion opened a hole in her starboard side and temporarily knocked out her center turbine. After 30 minutes of frantic repairs, she resumed her passage at 25 knots. The worst was yet to come. At 9:34 p.m., Scharnhorst struck a second mine off Ameland. This time, the damage was catastrophic. 1,000 tons of seawater flooded into the ship. Both main engines stopped. The steering gear failed. Electrical power was lost throughout the vessel. Every gun turret was damaged. For agonizing minutes, Scharnhorst lay dead in the water, helpless in the darkness. If the British had known, if they had been able to mount one more attack, the great battleship would have been theirs. But the British did not know. Their radar could no longer track the ships. Their aircraft were grounded. Their surface forces had been driven off. Slowly, Scharnhorst's engineers coaxed her starboard engine back to life. At 10:23 p.m., the battleship began moving again, limping toward home at 12 knots, carrying 1,000 tons of the North Sea in her wounded hull. On the morning of the 13th of February 1942, Gneisenau and Prinz Eugen entered the Elbe estuary and tied up at Brunsbüttel. At 10 a.m., Scharnhorst finally reached Wilhelmshaven, her starboard engines barely turning, her hull sitting dangerously low in the water. That afternoon, Admiral Ciliax sent his signal to Naval Group Command West in Paris. "It is my duty to inform you that Operation Cerberus has been successfully completed." In London, the news landed like a bomb. The Times published a leading article that would be quoted for decades. Vice Admiral Ciliax has succeeded where the Duke of Medina Sidonia failed. Nothing more mortifying to the pride of our sea power has happened since the 17th century. Winston Churchill addressed the House of Commons on 17 February, forced to explain how 3 enemy capital ships had sailed through the English Channel, waters Britain had controlled since the defeat of the Spanish Armada, in broad daylight. No one can doubt the vigor and courage with which the enemy squadron was attacked as soon as its movement was perceived, Churchill said, and of course, everyone is very sorry that these ships were not sunk. It was masterful understatement masking a profound humiliation. Churchill ordered an inquiry under Justice Alfred Bucknell. The report, kept secret until 1946, found that Coastal Command had failed to ensure adequate dawn reconnaissance, that the significance of German radar jamming had been missed, and that involving Bomber Command in an operation it was utterly untrained for had been a mistake. Historian Ken Ford would later call the inquiry perforce, a whitewash, blaming instrument failures rather than incompetence. The British had lost 42 aircraft and suffered approximately 250 casualties. They had thrown every available weapon at the German squadron and achieved nothing. And yet the story does not end with German triumph. On the night of 26 to 27 February 1942, just 2 weeks after her triumphant return, Gneisenau was struck by RAF bombs while in dry dock at Kiel. One bomb penetrated her armored deck and detonated her forward magazine. The explosion threw her forward turret completely off its mount and killed more than 100 sailors. Gneisenau would never sail again. Plans to rebuild her with larger guns were eventually abandoned, and she ended the war as a block ship, scuttled in the harbor at Gdynia. Prinz Eugen fared little better. On 23 February, while en route to Norway, she was torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Trident. Her stern was blown off and she would spend months under repair. She would survive the war only to be used as a target ship during the atomic bomb tests at Bikini Atoll. Scharnhorst required 6 months of repairs after her mine damage. She would eventually deploy to Norway, exactly as Hitler had intended, to threaten the Arctic convoys carrying supplies to the Soviet Union. On Boxing Day 1943, Scharnhorst sortied to attack convoy JW-55B. She was intercepted by the battleship HMS Duke of York and her escorts in what became known as the Battle of the North Cape. In the freezing darkness of the Arctic winter, British shells and torpedoes finally accomplished what the Channel Dash had failed to achieve. Scharnhorst went down with 1,932 of her crew. Only 36 men survived. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder himself delivered the verdict on Operation Cerberus. It was, he said, a tactical success, but a strategic defeat. He was right. The ships that had tied down British resources at Brest, that had threatened the Atlantic lifeline, were now removed from the equation entirely. The RAF could redirect its bombers from Brest to the industrial cities of Germany. The Royal Navy no longer needed to guard against a breakout into the Atlantic. Hitler had feared an Allied invasion of Norway that would never come. He had sacrificed his most valuable surface ships to defend against a phantom threat. Werner Rahn, author of the German semi-official history of the war at sea, concluded that Operation Cerberus was a tactical success that could not disguise the fact of a strategic withdrawal. The ships had simply exchanged one prison for another. But none of this diminishes the scale of the British failure, nor the extraordinary courage displayed on both sides. The German sailors who steamed into the lion's mouth, the Luftwaffe pilots who flew continuous cover for 30 hours, Adolf Galland, who orchestrated perhaps the most successful air-naval cooperation of the entire war, and Eugene Esmonde, who led 6 obsolete biplanes against impossible odds because that was his duty, and who now lies beneath the cold waters of the English Channel with the men who followed him. The Channel Dash remains a case study in boldness, planning, and the catastrophic consequences of assuming the enemy will behave as expected. Sometimes the impossible happens.